But for the moose, it's more, not that the moose will talk about cubs. So yeah, how's it going over there, dude?
Yeah, it's good.
You haven't really talked since you started. Yeah.
Dude, I was going to say, I feel like we haven't caught up in a while. Yeah, so I started 3 weeks ago at Huawei as a senior research scientist, which is a nice $10 title. But yeah, it's been a lot of fun. People are great. Mainly the last couple of weeks has just been onboarding, finally starting on a couple projects, which I'm not allowed to talk about, all this like corporate NDA business. But yeah, but it's keeping me busy, man. Yeah, definitely feeling the pinch of having 2 jobs. Like I was hoping to join the Infinite Jest reading group, but there's no way I can fit that in at the moment.
Yeah, that's a fucking job in and of itself. So
yeah, how are you finding it? Like worth the slog?
Yeah, I think really worth it. I think our second meeting was especially nice. Like we started actually picking up on some like themes and some connections, and like I have a couple lenses from which to view it, and we're actually like all contributing to like this little like a Rome document. Nice. And starting to we just dump in observations and then link it to various chapters. And then you get a sort of hive mind going of like how you're thinking about stuff. And then you can rely on other people's to pick up connections that you missed. And then you pick up some things other people missed. And you're just like slowly piecing together random shit over time. And I think it's just the kind of book where like you have to resign yourself to the fact that you'll never get 100% of it. Yeah. Right. And probably you could read it every 5 years for the rest of your life. And you'd always pick up connections and themes that you hadn't seen before. But so you just have to be happy with like what you do pick up and understand the themes that you do see and then just roll with those. Right. And then and know there's kind of always more waiting for you. So, but I definitely understand now why people either sort of love it or hate it. Like it's kind of got a cult following, and then everyone outside of that following is like, fuck this book. Like, this dude's just writing a bunch of nonsense, and but
his prose style and his writing style is so hypnotic in the sense that you just find yourself reading these long sentences and you might not even get everything that's being said, but you're still kind of just like letting the words take you for a ride, and your eyes just like keeps going. And it's really cool when you get in these passages.
The man's skill with English vocabulary is just unmatched by I think anyone I've ever read. Like the way he can just string together concepts and words from all these different places and then elegantly like weave it together into some sentence that just has certainly never been written by anyone else ever before or even thought of, is like unparalleled. It would have been so interesting to like speaking to him, like when he wasn't doing an interview or something, if you were just alone in a room, like having a conversation with him. I really wonder what he was like.
I remember listening to an interview with him and having this impression of being very underwhelmed because I had read a lot of Hitchens and then listened to interviews of Hitchens, and the man, it was as impressive when he was speaking as when he was writing. But I realized that most authors aren't actually like that. Like the writing voice and the in-person voice are so separate that it's kind of like jarring when you meet them in person.
Paul Graham's another example.
Oh yeah.
Terrible speaker.
But yeah, that was my brief impression. I think the one exception to that was his This Is Water speech, which is just exceptional.
But also prepared.
Prepared, exactly.
To be honest, that sort of tracks with a lot of the themes in the book. Like a big theme is the fundamental inability for people to like communicate directly what's in their heads. It's sort of Popperian in a way. Like there's no way for me to just transmit to you exactly what I'm thinking and feeling in this moment. There's always this like barrier, no matter how eloquent you can express ideas, like you're always going to be misunderstood in sort of fundamental ways. And he sort of takes that to the limit. Like some characters have a severe inability to like really express their feelings. And when they're thinking to themselves, they're like eloquent and passionate. And then when they try and speak to other people, it just comes out like people can barely understand them. And so I wonder if he felt that about himself almost, that in interviews, he was sort of incapable of expressing what he was feeling and what was going on in his head at the time. So in some sense, that the fact that he was worse in interviews sort of tracks, actually.
You could say that language suffers from a nebulosity problem. to foreshadow slightly.
To foreshadow Vaden's disparaging remarks for a certain philosophy that we're going to chat about.
Well, fuck, should we grab a drink and get into it? I have so much to talk about.
Let's fucking do it. Let's dive in.
So today we are talking about David Chapman, David Chapman's work on meta-rationality in particular. I'm assuming his name will be familiar to some of our audience, in particular our audience which overlaps with the Do Explain podcast with the charming and lovely Chris Lovegren, who has been running a ongoing series on David Chapman over the last couple years with Jake Orthwine, who's brilliant and interesting and has a lot of great thoughts and contributions. And so they've been exploring the work of David Chapman and it's been kind of set up as people think critical rationalism is great. David Chapman has pointed out a number of very significant deficiencies or criticisms or contradictions in critical rationalism. And David Chapman's work, in particular, Meta-Rationality, promises to address all of these and solve them and replace critical rationalism with meta-rationalism, which is like critical rationalism minus all of the problems. And so that's how it's kind of being discussed on the Do Explain podcast. And that got me really interested in it. But then I started diving into the primary material myself, and I have a very different reading on this entire thing than the Do Explain folks. So I think Ben and I are going to riff a little bit on that. But I should say at the onset that open invite to Jake and Chris to come on here and just knock some sense into me, because I'm probably going to say a bunch of harsh things that may be addressed in Chapman's work. And so just open invite to clear up the record after we're done. So so maybe I'll pass it over to you to see what just kind of high level thoughts you have before we start maybe explaining some components of Chapman's work. We're not going to go into all of it. I suggest we don't even attempt to explain the whole thing, and instead focus on two of the major critiques. One focused on Chapman's concept of nebulosity, and the second is Chapman's critique of the correspondence theory of truth, which is informed by his concept of nebulosity. I should also say that Chapman's work includes other concepts like Buddhism and I think embodiment, and I haven't fully understood how those relate to the grander picture. But diving into his nebulosity stuff and his correspondence theory of truth stuff, I have frankly been decently unimpressed. And so I'm not terribly interested to go into the weeds on these other subjects, which is perhaps why I haven't spent too much time there. But I hope that the takeaway for our audience is that even if you know nothing of Chapman and aren't terribly interested in going into Chapman, you still gain something from his critiques, which I think can be understood in isolation. And the critiques are interesting and valid. And so we need to address them. And if you want to go deeper into Chapman's work, I think having a good grounding in these two concepts will allow you to understand some of his other work better. So that's how I was going to propose we try to discuss this material. But yeah, over to you. What do you think in high level strokes?
Yeah, so I'm not as antagonistic as you are towards meta-rationality, perhaps because I haven't actually read much of it. So most of my understanding has been informed by Jake's conversations with Chris, and then some messages with Chris privately, and then some messages with Jake about just like clearing stuff up and me asking some random questions and them sending some resources. So I really feel like quite agnostic about the whole project. And I think, yeah, it raises some interesting criticisms, raises some questions I hadn't thought much about before. I always like that sort of thing. So I've been trying to understand exactly what they're on about over there, but no strong feelings. I'm not going to play absolute defender or absolute attacker in this. I'm just going to see sort of what your positions are and then perhaps agree, perhaps disagree, hopefully disagree, because it'll make it more interesting. Try and bring you back down to earth a little bit. But yeah, I really haven't actually read much of Chapman's original stuff. So I won't pretend I have and that I have a super informed worldview about exactly what he would say. One thing just at the outset that I would say is I think he would disagree with your characterization of meta-rationalism as trying to replace critical rationalism with something else. I think he shudders at the idea of sort of a unified rationalism. He sort of doesn't think that approach actually makes any sense. So he's got this big criticism of just like epistemology as a subject in and of itself, and doesn't really think it makes sense to talk about epistemology in broad strokes. He rather thinks like different disciplines, different areas have different ways to generate knowledge, and we should just in practice look at the ways people are generating knowledge and to try and generate some broad abstract framework that characterizes knowledge creation as like the general principles underlying knowledge creation is a mistake already. So anyway, we can dive into that criticism, but I think he wouldn't say he's trying to replace critical rationalism with something else. I think he would rather say the entire project of coming up with like general rules of rationality and epistemology is sort of an incoherent project. So that's my understanding of his view. And he wouldn't say like, he wouldn't want to say like, I'm proposing meta-rationalism. He would say rationalism as it's been construed so far is sort of a mistake. And there's sort of no such thing as like the rationalist project in the abstract.
Okay. So part of the meta-rationalist framework is doing away with the idea of frameworks.
Yeah. That's my understanding. So I think he really takes issue with like studying epistemology in and of itself. He doesn't really think you can have general principles of epistemology that apply in all situations. And if someone's proposing such principles, they will either be like vacuous and trivial, or they will be wrong. And so he would like say something like Popper's guessing and checking is sort of vacuously true. Like, yes, you can't have final certainty. So everything is sort of a guess and check, but that just doesn't actually tell you that much about in practice, like how to make breakfast or how to learn how to ride a bike or how to learn math or something. And so talking at this abstract level of conjecture and refutations or just sort of the fundamental laws of epistemology, he would take issue with that. Again, I'm going to keep saying he would take issue with that, but this is obviously should be filtered through the lens of like my understanding of the criticism. So
okay, interesting. Yeah. Like I can't escape the fact that when I read him, it seems like he's offering a framework. And even if your principle is you shouldn't have general principles, it's still a principle.
Yeah, that was my thought too.
Yeah. And to say that you can never have any sort of principle elides the all-important distinction between the kinds of principles, right? Like to make a statement that you shouldn't have principles is a principle. And so I don't know how you can escape that. So I got to say at the onset, so I would recommend our listeners listen to the conversations with Jake and Chris, but I have to recommend it with a caveat. And I'm curious if this caveat lands with you or not. So my experience listening to Jake and Chris is that Jake will explain critical rationalism and I'll think, yep, he's nailed it, understands it very well, as a great summary, totally gets it. Then he'll explain Deutschian epistemology and like the subtle differences between Deutsch and Popper. And again, I'm like, yep, nailed it. That's totally how I think about it, 100%. And then he'll start talking about David Chapman. And within 45 seconds, I'm like, I have no idea what the fuck they're talking about. And I'm completely lost instantly. And I do not attribute this to Jake. I think Jake is accurately representing the source material. But I have to say that I don't think Chapman is a very clear writer. And I think that his ideas ironically suffer from nebulosity itself, in the sense that very often I'm like, I don't know what he's saying. And he keeps promising to deliver the goods, but I don't know where the goods are. And he keeps saying that there is this answer that meta-rationality offers. And I don't know how that answer doesn't take the form of some sort of principle or set of principles, even if that principle is do away with principles. And so I recommend the conversations, but if the listener finds themselves quite confused as soon as the meta-rationality subject comes up, you're not alone. And I guess I'm curious if that was your experience or if I'm just uniquely obtuse on these particular matters.
No, it's funny you say that. That was exactly my experience. And in fact, so I had a conversation, sort of private conversation with Chris that was released on Do Explain's Patreon only stream, so only available for patrons. And I levied basically the exact same criticism. And I said, there's something in me that recoils at a conversational style that hides the ball for so long. And I understand, like you said, like Jake is very funny and very clear and obviously super smart, but there's something in me that is inherently sort of like repelled by ideas that refuse to give you like, they'll point out problems, but then refuse to like tell you exactly how they answer those kind of problems.
Or say that the answer is coming. The answer is coming. The answer is coming. The answer is eventually coming.
And I mean, in some sense, like the way I described it to Chris is like, that's sort of like an emotional prior on my end, because that's not really a legitimate argument in and of itself, because you could, for example, levy a similar criticism against like some like abstract math, right? If I'm to tell you like, oh, I promise like you can cash this out as this crazy thing called like a Lebesgue integral, but you're going to have to go through 2 semesters of calculus before I tell you how you're actually going to be able to solve the things that aren't solved with Riemannian integration with the Lebesgue integral. But you have to do all this stupid shit first. You'd be like, are you fucking serious? You can't just tell me what the Lebesgue integral is.
Yeah.
And so in some sense, it's not a valid criticism, but especially when it comes to just like epistemology, common sense, etc., I find, arguments that hide the ball for so long to be a little suspicious. Moreover, what I find odd about Chapman stuff is the fact that he proclaims that his contributions are fundamentally more applied and practical than other epistemologies. So I think he's largely driven by the fact that he views other undertakings like critical rationalism or Bayesianism or like other lenses on epistemology to be too abstract, right? A big part of his criticism is like, they don't explain how you actually make breakfast or like actually learn how to ride a bike, right? And I think that's actually somewhat valid. But then, if you refuse to sort of like explain to me how you do that, then there seems to be like a problem there. So yeah, in some sense, I agree. And I think you can actually point out the criticisms that he would have with something like CR, like without too much effort. So I'm a little confused why they don't seem to like get around to those points earlier than they in fact do in practice.
Yeah, well, so I went rooting for the punchline, and so I'm going to hide the ball a little bit, but I promise that I will deliver Chapman's answer to a lot of these critiques because I found the relevant quotes. And maybe to foreshadow, the answer that he gives is the answer that Popper gives. Like, there's nothing new. That's my biggest thing. Like, when you finally get to what he's saying we should do instead, it is identical to what Popper says we should do, just using slightly different words, which is kind of annoying because it indicates that he hasn't read the source material, which is fine. Like, you don't need to read there's no obligation to read Popper. But I think if you're going to critique all rationalisms, then you should at least cross your T's and dot your I's and make sure that the material hasn't already been covered by Popper, because he has covered it. And so that's one of the things I'm going to go into. But on the Lebesgue or Riemann integration point, I think even there you can do it without hiding the ball. I think you could say something like, well, Riemann integration is built upon partitioning the x-axis, and Lebesgue integration is built upon partitioning the y-axis. And that doesn't completely explain what Lebesgue integration is compared to Riemann integration, but it's a way to say quite quickly what the answer is going to be, even if it then takes some steps to fully understand what it's all about. And so I think even in the case of like mathematics or complex ideas, you may not be able to deliver the full answer immediately, but you can start delivering the answer at a very coarse grain resolution, and then start making it more and more specific as the understanding of the person you're trying to communicate to starts to increase. And so I think it's possible to not do this, I promise we'll get there thing, even in the case of complex ideas. And that's just a very important skill that a writer should develop. And it becomes even more important when you have complex ideas. But yeah, okay, so we talked a bit about David Chapman. So who is he? He did his PhD in artificial intelligence in MIT in 1990. He is not to be confused with the David Chapman who appears on Google when you Google him, because I guess Mark David Chapman is the dude who murdered John Lennon.
Oh, shit.
So we should just keep the two Chapmans separate. If you Google Chapman's name, add the keyword meta-rationality so you don't get sucked into a who murdered John Lennon rabbit hole, which I thought was kind of funny. But okay, so let's get into it. So again, we're not going to try to explain all of meta-rationality because there's just a lot of different components that I haven't fully understood. But the two main components, or maybe the central component, is the concept of nebulosity. And that's one of the themes which Jake and Chris have spent a significant amount of time talking about. And I think the source of all of his other critiques on rationalism. So before we go into nebulosity, would you agree with that characterization that this is kind of like one of the central concepts of Chapman's work?
Yeah, I believe so. Or at least, yeah, of what Jake and Chris have discussed. So, yeah.
Okay, so let me do my best attempt to explain nebulosity to you, and then correct me if it disagrees with your conception of it. And then we'll use that as the foundation. So here's my attempt at explaining nebulosity. So the central problem is that if you have a given object, there's an infinite number of different ways you can categorize that object. And there doesn't seem to exist a single canonical category, which is obviously the correct one. So, for example, if you have an object like a chair, you could think of the chair as like a piece of furniture, or a collection of wood and screws and glue, or a collection of atoms or quarks, etc. So we don't really know what a chair actually is. We don't know the true category into which it belongs, and therefore there isn't a perfectly clear and precise boundary which we can use to separate the chair from everything around it that's not the chair. And so it is said that the chair is intrinsically nebulous, and the kind of the fancy philosophy word for category in this context is ontology. So we would say that there does not exist a single objective ontology into which we can categorize the chair. But obviously this doesn't apply only to chairs. It applies to cups and every other object in the universe. And so the entire universe is said to be ontologically nebulous because there is no single definitive categorization we can use to separate things from other things in the world. So the world, Chapman says, is intrinsically nebulous, and this opens up a huge number of problems, so Chapman says, in rationality and in critical rationalism, because what does it even mean to say something like nothing can travel faster than the speed of light when we can't even precisely define what we mean by light or like a thing that's traveling? And so our fundamental scientific premises don't even get off the ground, because when we use language, there's no way that our language can precisely map onto stuff in the world, because we haven't got to the problem of linguistic nebulosity and the fact that words can mean different things. And so because we can't do this like precise mapping between like words and things in the world, rationalism is doomed and it crumbles. And this is where meta-rationalism comes to save the day, because unlike rationalism, meta-rationalism can handle nebulosity and therefore can better handle the real world difficulties which we face every day. Okay, that's my attempted summary.
Does he actually use the faster than speed of light example?
No, I just brought that up. But like, this is, I think, entailed in the critique of the correspondence theory of truth, because we'll get there. But I think this would be something he would say, because if the world is nebulous, then we can't even talk coherently about stuff in the world. And so we don't really know what we're talking about when we talk about things like light or atoms or chairs or tables or cups.
I'm not sure he would agree that we can't talk coherently about tables and chairs and cups. I'm quite sure he would not say that.
Well, so I think he would say that we can't talk coherently within the rationalist framework. So he's going to talk about correspondence theory of truth. What's the correspondence theory of truth? The idea that words correspond to reality. So if you can't have a statement corresponding to reality in a truth sense, then you also can't have a statement corresponding to reality in any other kind of sense as well. And so to say something like nothing can travel faster than the speed of light, how does that correspond to reality? Chapman would say that rationalisms have a big gap there. They can't explain that, but meta-rationalism can.
Okay, let's just back up to make sure we're not losing people. So there's a couple of concepts which, when you first hear the concept of nebulosity, you might confuse it with. So what Chapman is not saying, that like subjectivity rules everything, that the world is not some specific way. So he definitely agrees the world is like some particular way, meaning, and the problem is when I try and explain this, I always end up explaining it in like sort of reductionistic language. And I'm not sure how he escapes this problem. But anyway, but there are like, there's atoms and they're patterned in like some way. And so when you're saying something like the concept of a cup is nebulous, what Chapman's not saying is like, there's a cup there for me, but not for you. Like you could put your hand into that space and like not find a cup, and I could put my hand into that space and find a cup. He's not advocating some sort of subjective anti-realism where like everyone sees the world differently and like reality is different for each sort of person. So that's like just the one clarification to make that someone like might be confused about. So he agrees like the world is sort of one particular way, and he always uses the word pattern to explain this. So of like the world is patterned in sort of like these non-random ways. But nebulosity, as I understand it, refers to the fact that like different agents will see the world differently depending on how they're interacting with the world. So a human's gonna understand objects in the world. It's going to understand the same patterns in the world that a moose sees in the world, but the moose is going to understand those patterns as something else, right? So the moose probably is not going to parse up those atoms into something like a cup, because the cup is like some foreign object to the moose that it doesn't even understand the notion of a cup, right? So it's not going to see cup. It'll just probably, if there was a table with a cup on it, it would see that whole thing as like one object for the moose, right? Because it has no experience with separating tables and cups and using cups to drink coffee and things like that. So in some sense, the table and cup are still there, but humans break up atoms in particular ways depending on how we're interacting with the world. So depending on basically the usefulness with which we find these various categories. So it's very useful for us to talk about cups and coasters and tables, but for the moose, it's more not that the moose will talk about cups, but it'll think more in terms of trees and bushes and obstacles and other predators, say, right? So the world is one way, but different creatures will sort of parse up the world differently depending on how they're interacting with the world. And so my understanding is that this is the concept of nebulosity. So the fact that like the moose is not necessarily going to see a cup parse up the world as a cup, but humans will. So the world is inherently sort of nebulous like that. There's no concepts that come pre-embedded into the world as it is. The concepts that we use to parse up the world are different depending on what sort of creatures we are.
So this is what I was trying to get at when I said there's an infinite number of different ways to categorize stuff. And so maybe a very concrete way to establish what we're talking about is, you imagine you take a photograph of anything, a natural scene or a picture of a room, and you give it to 10 different people and you say, okay, draw the edges between different objects, and you get these pictures back.
Right.
Every person's going to slightly draw the edges differently. So maybe I will draw an edge consisting of an entire chair, and maybe Ben will draw separate edges for the legs and the cushion and the backing of the chair. And so there's not a single definitive way to slice and dice, to categorize, to partition the world. And that's very different than saying that when I give you the photograph, you see a chair, and when you give it to somebody else, they just don't see a chair at all. So they're not denying the existence of chairs. They're just saying that there's no way to objectively superimpose a single ontology on top of all the patterns that we see.
And there's no objective right answer there. Like when you circle the chair and I circle the components of the chair, no one's objectively right in that sense.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's the concept of nebulosity. So the main thing we should say here before we dive into the specifics, and specifically how nebulosity informs the correspondence theory of truth, is that rather than this being something Popper's epistemology can't handle, nebulosity is one of the central ideas Popper's epistemology is built upon. And he talks explicitly about nebulosity in the first chapter of Conjectures and Refutations. And it's just like clear that no one has gone and just double checked that Popper hasn't covered this already. Because I just want to read one quote, but then some others, specifically drawing attention to where Popper addresses nebulosity. So in Beginning of Infinity, Deutsch talks about how Popper would open his lectures by asking his students to observe. And then his students come back and say, well, observe what? What do you want me to observe? Mm-hmm. And then Popper would give them a task, give them a problem, and that would allow them to observe some particular thing. And so the way that this ties to Popper's epistemology is that Popper says that all observations are theory-laden, meaning that it is the brain which gives structure to what we see, and observations alone aren't sufficient to gain knowledge and to understand the world. We actually have to do work. So he talks about this in Conjectures and Refutations, and then he gives the following example. So he says, a hungry animal divides the environment into edible and inedible things. An animal in flight sees roads to escape and hiding places. Generally speaking, this is the key thing about nebulosity, objects change according to the needs of the animal. We may add that objects can be classified and can become similar or dissimilar only in this way, by being related to needs and interests. This rule applies not only to animals, but also to scientists. For the animal, a point of view is provided by its needs, the task of the moment, and its expectations. And for the scientist, by his theoretical interests, the special problem under investigation, his conjectures and anticipations, and the theories which he accepts as a kind of background, his frame of reference, his horizon of expectation. So this is already baked into Popper's epistemology, because if we could just observe the world as it is and gain knowledge, that would mean the world has a predefined ontology, which we just have to observe and see. But it doesn't, and Popper totally recognizes that it doesn't. And this is what he means when he says that all observations are theory-laden. So all observations can only be understood and categorized with reference to the person or the organism doing the observing and doing the classification. And the classification will change depending on the needs and the problem situation of said organism. So nowhere does Popper require a objective ontology. And in fact, Popper explicitly recognizes that there does not exist such a thing. And this is one of his central contributions, that he recognized that in order to understand what you see, you need to bring to your observations a ontology which is dependent on the problem you're trying to solve, your background knowledge, your theories, your assumptions. And when the background knowledge, the theories, the problem changes, so too will the ontology change. So I have more to say, but I'll stop there to see if you agree or disagree that Popper basically already addressed the nebulosity property of reality. And that's what he's getting at when he says all observation is theory-laden. And that's what he's trying to emphasize when he uses the injunction to just observe. He's trying to emphasize that you can't actually observe without having a problem or a need, a task, which gives you something to observe. And so to return to what category do we put a chair? Well, that entirely depends on the problem that you have. So if you have a guest coming to your home and they're looking for a place to sit, you may look at the chair and think that fits in the category of sitting object and view the chair that way. If you have to screw in a light bulb, you may categorize the chair differently. You may think, oh, this chair now can be thought of amongst the class of objects that allow me to stand and gain extra height. If you need firewood because you are out of energy and you're cold, then all of a sudden the chair changes its categorization and now becomes fuel and just becomes a kind of fuel. And so when your situation changes, the category into which you will put a particular object changes. And this is what Popper means when he says that what you observe in the world depends on the problem that you have or the task at hand. And this is not a concept which critical rationalism crumbles when faced with, but it's rather a concept which critical rationalism takes as a primitive and builds on top of.
I think, one thing to say is that Chapman doesn't actually explicitly reference Popper, I don't think, in any of his writing. So I don't think he's not arguing against critical rationalism.
But he is arguing against all rationalisms. He says explicitly everywhere that all rationalisms fail when met with this problem.
He also gives a precise definition for rationalism, though, that I'm not sure. I think what you're arguing is critical rationalism doesn't fall prey to the mistakes that rationalisms, as he defines them, fall to, which is fine. I think the critique you're making, though, is valid in the sense that, insofar as he's claiming to have come up with some new insight, then it fails on the account that Popper obviously recognized that this was a problem to begin with. So that's a fair critique. But I just wanted to make clear for the audience that Chapman is not coming out swinging against Popper, for example. We've sort of set up that conflict just because of the history with Jake and Chris and them trying to wrestle with how all of this fits into Popperianism. But Chapman, in fact, I think I've seen him on Twitter threads. He doesn't actually know what critical rationalism is. So he's never arguing against critical rationalism per se. He's defined rationalism as a very particular set of things that I forget his precise definition, but
so on that point, that's basically my takeaway, is that he isn't developing a different theory from critical rationalism. He's basically just rediscovering it in his own terms, in what I'll say in an opinionated fashion, in a slightly less clear and less thorough way than Popper has. But as we'll see later, the solutions that he arrives at is exactly the solution that Popper arrived at 70 years earlier. So there is nothing new in what I've read that hasn't already been addressed in greater detail by Popper. And I mean, fair play, he maybe recognized some of the same problems Popper did and then came up with solutions that are very similar, or what I'm going to argue are identical to what Popper says. But so maybe that's not necessarily a critique of Chapman. It's maybe a critique in the sense that he didn't do as thorough a literature review as perhaps he should have. But it is a critique on people who are positioning Chapman's work as a corrective to Popper, because it's not. It's just a simulacrum. It's just an approximation to Popper's writing. And that's what I'm going to try to argue quite forcefully throughout this conversation.
Nice. So I think let's move to the correspondence theory of truth, because I don't think I've heard anyone say that Popper didn't recognize the importance of something like nebulosity. But I think they would argue that he's relying on the correspondence theory of truth, and the correspondence theory of truth implicitly falls prey to this problem. Yeah. So let's just briefly discuss what the correspondence theory of truth is. I think to just put it in the most broad terms possible that everyone would agree on, the correspondence theory of truth says that for a statement to be true, it needs to correspond with an actual state of affairs as they are in the world. So we issue a statement, a proposition, and we say that that thing is true insofar as it maps onto the world as it is. Now, I've deliberately hidden a little bit of ambiguity by saying statement or proposition. I don't think maybe we will get there eventually, but there's some work on differentiating those categories and saying our statements are actually fuzzy versions of propositions which actually live in some perfect abstract space. And then it's those propositions with which perfectly either are true or false and either do or do not correspond to reality. But I think for the sake of just general understanding to get us off the ground, let's just, you make a statement and we say that if that statement corresponds to the world as it is, then it's true. And if it doesn't, then it's false. I think that's relatively unambiguous. And this seems, and so here's where I start to think, so hopefully you can convince me otherwise, but I think Chapman starts to make some good points here, which is that this does seem to implicitly rely on positing sort of one particular ontology in the world. So if I make the claim, this cup is red, then if you're relying on the correspondence theory of truth to tell you if that statement is true or false, then it's saying this is true if and only if there is such a thing as a cup in the world and that is red. But we've already discussed that the world can be broken up in sort of arbitrarily many ways, depending on your problem situation, what sort of organism you are, etc. So how is it that a statement can actually correspond objectively, precisely to how the world is, right? If people can cut up the world into cups and, cups and no cups or absence of cups, etc. Mm-hmm. And so I think that's an interesting problem. I'm sort of not sure what to think about it, but I'd love for you to tell us why we're all confused about this problem and why it's actually a non-problem.
I would love to. Yeah. But I want to make a few comments about correspondence theoretic truth. One is that the correspondence theory of truth is the common sense theory of truth that everybody has without studying philosophy. And this is just what people mean when they say something is true. There are alternatives. So there's one theory of truth that says something is true if everybody believes it to be true. Another theory of truth says that something is true if it's useful. So this is kind of like the Jordan Peterson view of truth. But if you're called to the witness stand and a judge says, Ben, I need you to give me the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. And then you say, okay, well, I define truth to be what everybody thinks is useful. So that's my definition of truth. And that's what I'm going to give you. The judge is going to send you to jail because this is bullshitting. Everyone knows what's meant. If you say that you were at the shop at 8 p.m., then you damn well better have been at the shop at 8 p.m. Otherwise, you're lying. And so what Popper has written so extensively about is the correspondence theory of truth, but that's not exactly right to say because correspondence theory of truth has been around since like Aristotle. But what Popper was really excited about was Alfred Tarski's rehabilitation of the correspondence theory of truth, because it kind of lost favor and like people started saying you couldn't really precisely explain what you mean by that. And what Alfred Tarski did was he found a way to formalize this concept in an explicit way. And he introduced this idea of a meta language, which we won't go into it. That's not very important. But okay, so this is, I think, important to go into because the quote that I read earlier, you could say something like, okay, fine, maybe Popper has recognized that categories will change depending on the need at the time, but he hasn't fully recognized the implications or the difficulties this poses to his theory. And simply acknowledging it in conjectures and refutations is not sufficient because he has to address the consequences of nebulosity to correspondence theoretic truth, but also just to his entire theory. But he's dealt with all this too. And so we'll go into details, but the references that I wanted to point people to who want to see where Popper goes into this, I'll point people to two places. The main one is Open Society and Its Enemies around the Aristotle section, which I think is about like halfway through, where he has an extensive discussion about words and their definitions. And if anyone is going into the source material around this section, do not skip the footnotes because in the footnotes is basically an entire additional essay on this subject. So read the chapter and then read all the footnotes because both the footnotes and the chapter themselves contain deep discussion. That's the first place that he's talked about this. The second place that he's talked about this extensively is in the first chapter of his autobiography, where he talks about the quest for precision. And so he addresses this difficulty both in his discussion of words and his discussion on precision. And these can be found in Open Society and his autobiography. So, okay, so you've perfectly set up the problem, which is something like, if you make a statement like the grass is green, you can never say if that's true or not, because what do you mean by grass and what do you mean by green? Grass could refer to an entire lawn with brown leaves on it, in which case maybe the brown leaves mean that the grass isn't green, or it can refer to individual grass shoots, or maybe we're talking about grass in the summertime where it's brown. So because we can never be perfectly precise in our language, statements can never correspond to reality because we don't know which part of reality we're talking about. Tiny side comment on the propositions statements thing. That was introduced by Deutsch in a tentative talk he gave, which I think he set that talk up by saying he's exploring some new ideas. He doesn't know if this is true or not. And I found that his distinction between propositions and statements to be kind of just moving the problem back one, because if you're allowed to just define propositions
is the exact
you have to explain why propositions don't suffer from ambiguity, and I don't know how you could really do that, but I think there's a much simpler answer which Popper addresses, and I think this is a pseudo problem, because basically if this critique was true, it wouldn't just show that the correspondence theory of truth fails, but it would show that all communication is impossible, because language could never refer to anything. So not only could you not make factual statements, but you couldn't ask questions, you couldn't tell stories, because people would not know what the hell you're talking about every time you spoke, because the words wouldn't refer to anything in the world. So not only could you not tell the truth, but you couldn't lie. You couldn't communicate, because to lie is to say I was at the shop at 7 p.m. when you were there at 8 p.m. And then people would say, well, what do you mean by shop? What do you mean by 7 p.m.? Are you using Pacific time? Or are you using Greenwich time? All of it's ambiguous. All of it's vague. All of it's nebulous. And so if it was true that language, in order for it to work, must be perfectly precise and have no ambiguities, then we as a species would never have evolved language in the first place, because language would never be able to refer to anything.
No. Wait, though. I mean, Chapman's not saying... Okay, I'm a little confused by your critique there. Like, Chapman's not saying language has to be precise to get us out of this issue. I mean, he agrees that language is imprecise, right? Mm-hmm. His question, I think, his problem is driven by, okay, given that we have this imprecision inherent in language, but clearly we are still communicating about things and we can make progress, we can make scientific discoveries, we can do all this amazing stuff. Like, how is that happening? Mm-hmm. And he wants to criticize, like some people would say, it's happening because somehow because of the correspondence theory of truth. Like, why are we able to communicate effectively? Why are our scientific theories meaningful, et cetera? It's because at the end of the day, you cash them out in terms of the correspondence theory of truth. That's how we're approximating reality and making progress. And I think he wants to say, no, that's not the mechanism. That's the wrong mechanism. Of course, he would of course agree that our language and stuff is imprecise, but he wants to say there's a different solution to this problem that doesn't rely on the correspondence theory of truth. That's my understanding.
So I don't think you need the correspondence theory of truth to tell a story. I think you could tell a story without invoking the correspondence theory of truth or notions of truth at all. But what he's saying about the correspondence theory of truth would necessarily apply to telling a story as well, right? Because he's saying the correspondence theory of truth fails because when you say the cup is red, no one knows what you're talking about when you say cup or red, because...
But that's the claim he's not making. He's not saying no one knows what you're talking about. Like, clearly people do know what you're talking about. And he's saying that is sort of...
If people know what you're talking about, then why does that not save the correspondence theory of truth? Because if I know what you're talking about when I say the cup is red, or when you say the cup is red, then that's sufficient, because I know what you mean, and therefore I can evaluate if what you're saying is true or false.
But he's criticizing the underlying mechanism by which that's happening. So okay, we're telling a story, and I say the cup is red.
Sorry. So the way that I invoke to telling a story is trying to come up with a scenario where truth claims aren't important. So,
I know, but I think he's criticizing something. Like, I agree that you don't need the correspondence theory of truth to tell stories, but the way he's criticizing correspondence theory of truth, in my understanding, also is a criticism of how, for example, when we're telling stories, the meaning of what I mean when I say the cup is red is transferred to you. Okay, so like his criticism sort of it applies to just like in general, how are our minds mapping statements to reality?
So then what I said is accurate, which is that if I can't communicate to you that the cup is red because the meaning that I'm trying to communicate just can't cross this chasm, then so too with any other form of communication, because meaning can't make the jump.
But he's arguing about how the chasm crossing is happening. Like, obviously we all agree. It's you can't say that he doesn't think the chasm's being crossed somehow, right? No, like, obviously he agrees the chasm's being crossed.
But he's going to say that the chasm is only crossed by recognizing what he's going to introduce later as meta-rationality. But rationalism, without his contribution, can't explain that. Like, the correspondence theory of truth isn't sufficient. So similarly, the ability for me to communicate anything to you at all can't be explained by rationalism. So his critique is not just about correspondence theory of truth, but it's about all language in its entirety. So that's why I'm saying that if his critique was accurate, then we would not have evolved language. So this is what you're saying is imprecise, because you're saying we have evolved language, therefore this precise attachment to definitions and the correspondence theory of truth fails. And so does critical rationalism and all that, because it can't explain why we've evolved language. But meta-rationality, Chapman stuff can. But I just wanted to flag that your skepticism alarm should be ringing a little bit, because his critique of correspondence theory of truth isn't really a critique of correspondence theory of truth. It's a critique of all language everywhere.
No, I agree, which he explicitly says. So they talk a lot about like when you write down something on a piece of paper, it's just a bunch of symbols. Like, how does that thing actually get its meaning? How does that go from like just being a piece of paper that you've written down to like something that is representing the world in my head?
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
And that's the fundamental problem that they're trying to grapple with. Now, that fundamental problem applies to the correspondence theory of truth, right? But it's sort of more fundamental, if you want to use that word, right? It's more broad. And so I totally agree that like his critique applies more broadly than just like truth claims. It applies to stories. It applies to all communication. I totally agree. But he would also agree with that. And so the question, he's trying to answer the question, like, what the fuck is going on that we can communicate, right? And he would say like rationalism is offering one answer by means of perfect propositions that represent the world, and we're somehow passing those propositions back and forth to one another. And he would say that doesn't make any sense, and I'm going to offer another solution. I don't even know what his solution is, so I'm looking forward to when you explain like how he solves it. But that's my understanding of the problem.
Yeah, so perfect. So we're on the same page. So let's see how Popper addresses this, because he does address it. And Deutsch's attempt by making this distinction between statements proposition, I think, isn't persuasive and doesn't work. But I think Popper's perfectly does. So, okay, so what does Popper say? So quit hiding the ball. So the main thing to recognize is that a statement is never said or read in isolation, but it's always made and received relative to a set of shared background knowledge and shared implicit definitions. So it's not the statement on its own, it's statement plus shared background knowledge and shared implicit definitions. So what is an implicit definition? So one thing that people try to do is to make things more precise, you define them. But this immediately leads to an infinite regress, because if you define things, you just introduce more words that need to be defined, and that blows up to infinity. But that's not what we do. What we do is we rely on implicit definitions, where an implicit definition is something as simple as I point to a ball and I say to Georgia, ball. I'm not defining ball, I'm exemplifying ball. I'm saying this is how this word is used in this context. And knowledge of the word ball becomes an implicit definition where I don't define the word ball, I show what that word means and how it's used in context. And this is what we do all the time, because the vast majority of the words that we use, we can't actually define. Like if I was to ask you to define the word the, it would be very difficult, but we just know what these words mean. So when I write a statement like the grass is green, the statement is not read in isolation. The statement is read by someone whom I'm assuming has the same set of implicit definitions and shared background knowledge that I have when I write that statement. So when I write the word grass, I'm assuming that you have a similar implicit definition in your head of what is meant by grass. And taken together, that's what gives meaning. And that can, of course, fail. So Chapman uses the example of, is there water in the refrigerator? And then you look in the fridge and you say no. And then he's like, but there's an eggplant and there's water in the cells of the eggplant. You fool. So there is water in the refrigerator. And he takes this to be like a huge problem for rationalisms because they can't handle that fact. But there's nothing magic going on there. What's happening is when you ask, is there water in the refrigerator, you're using a certain set of implicit definitions and shared background knowledge, that the background knowledge specifies what we mean by refrigerator and is there, etc. And then when I say, there's water in the cells of the eggplant, what's happened is that I've been using a different set of implicit definitions and background knowledge than you have. Then you ask me to clarify the question. I say, okay, this is what I meant. This is my implicit definition. And then the answer changes. So like you can maybe make this a bit more clear by using an example from math. So what could be more precise than math? But Popper makes the point that math, just like any other symbolic representation of stuff, relies on implicit definitions. So if I say something like, is a mathematical statement 1 + 1 = 10, is that true? And you say, no, obviously not, because 1 + 1 = 2. And then I say, but what if the numbers are in binary? then all of a sudden it becomes true. And what's happened there is not that there's some crazy nebulous property of that statement. It's that I've just changed the implicit definitions. That you implicitly thought of the natural number system, and then I change it, and then the answer changes. So what's going on is I make a statement like 1 + 1 = 10. You interpret that statement, evaluate the truth claims, conditional on the background knowledge and background assumptions. You change that background knowledge and background assumptions, and then the answer changes. But that's what we do, because to communicate anything is to use a statement as a tool of communication to get my implicit definitions and my implicit knowledge over to your head. And so it's a communication tool. And I think that the Chapman analysis, and I say the Deutsche analysis too, fails to recognize that statements are never read in isolation, but statements plus background knowledge and implicit definitions. And so to go further, if I say, how cold is it outside? And you say, it's like 10 degrees. That might be perfectly precise enough for the problem that I'm trying to solve. But if my problem is like, I need to chill a chemical to 1/1000th of a degree precision, then all of a sudden it's 10 degrees outside is not precise enough for the problem I have at hand. And then all of a sudden I will unearth more of my implicit assumptions and definitions, change them, sharpen them. Popper summarizes this by saying that we should never be more precise than the problem situation demands. And so the amount of precision, the ontology you use, the categorization you bring is problem dependent. And the statements you use and interpret are interpreted in the context of background knowledge and implicit definitions. And I think that's the answer to how we can talk coherently about correspondence theory of truth, because it's that plus all this other stuff. And taken as a package, it all works out. So that's my summary of Popper's answer to this critique. How does that land? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, it lands well with me. I'm a little unsure whether to go in this direction, because this is stuff I find less convincing and I'm less confident about. And I'm not sure exactly what Chapman would say and stuff here. So you use the example with Georgia about like you point to a ball and now she has like the concept of a ball. How is she forming that concept? One, Popperians and Deutschians might want to say something like, she's conjecturing something. Like you point out the ball and now she conjectures something like, oh, this is, he wants this ball and all balls have some property, etc. Mm-hmm. How is she coming up with that representation of like what a ball is for her, right? Presumably she has now some idea of balls and no balls, or like what a ball is. How is that representation actually like forming in her mind? Like what's going on there? And two, it doesn't really make much sense to describe that process as like conjecture and criticism. I mean, it's sort of like bucket theory of mindish, right? Like you're pointing out a ball, you show her a ball, and now she's kind of like, oh, this thing's a ball. Like, is it right to actually describe that as conjecture and refutation? Or is it better to just describe that as you've shown her a ball and now she has some concept of what a ball is?
Yeah, well, so that is a question of developmental psychology, and a question of neuroscience. All interesting questions, but very separate from the criticism of the correspondence theory of truth, because the mechanism by which a brain comes up with a representation is fascinating, interesting, and you can argue about how much progress we've made. And I think describing it as conjectures and refutations is one useful lens, because like, how could it not be a conjecture? But it doesn't explain the whole procedure at all. Yeah. Like to say it's a conjecture is not wrong, but I also don't think that fully explains what's going on. And so to the claim that saying that's a conjecture is insufficient, I totally agree.
Like yes and.
Yeah, it's yes and. To say it's a conjecture is just the start of the inquiry. And let's not forget that everything is a conjecture. That idea is an important corrective to the idea that she just needs to observe it long enough, right? And so part of the power of saying, well, it's a conjecture is simply to eliminate an entire long rabbit hole, which philosophers have gone down for hundreds of years. And that rabbit hole is empiricism. And so the conjecture lens is useful to close a door that is going to lead us in the wrong direction, but it is not useful to fully explain the procedure by which Georgia makes a representation of the world. And that's where you need a lot of psychology and serious scholarship. But the purpose of pointing out the ball example is simply to emphasize that you can give words meaning without defining them. And you can give words meaning through exemplification. And that is how all words start their journey. And then the definitions come afterwards. Like, the first dictionary was written by Samuel Johnson in like the 1700s. But obviously people were using language well before that.
Him along with some crazy inmate.
Yeah, with an inmate. Oh, I didn't know that. That's a good detail. But so definitions came like way after the fact that we were using language, right? And so I just wanted to give an example of what I mean when I say implicit definition, which is that you can completely understand the meaning of a word based on how it's used, based on the context in which it's used. And you do not need a precise definition. But this is what Chapman et al. Is saying you need under the rationalist framework. So Chapman says that rationalism requires you have a precise definition of a word before you use the word. And that's just not the case. And that's like something which Popper has written about extensively, because he just recognized that it is impossible to have a precise definition of a word. It always has to bottom out in implicit definitions. And using a definition is only valuable when there's ambiguities amongst our implicit definitions. So if I say ball and you point to something that I didn't mean by that word, then that just means we have a different implicit definition. And that's when the definition of ball can potentially become useful. So I think that this fully addresses Chapman's critique of the failure of the correspondence theory of truth, in the sense that we cannot have and do not require perfect precision of our words before we use them. And if this is the case with language in general, then it is also the case with correspondence theoretic language. And so once you recognize that the language operates with this extra stuff, like one way to say it is, here's a better way. John McWhorter talks about how Shakespeare needs to be updated because a lot of the words that are used in Shakespeare's time simply don't map on to how we use them today. And that's why Shakespeare is difficult to read in places. But what's going on is that the implicit definitions have changed. 300 years later, whenever Shakespeare was writing, we just have slightly different associations with particular words. And that's why it needs to be updated. And so that's just a very clear example that something becomes hard to understand when the implicit definitions that are being used don't map between writer and receiver in a precise way. And so this is the resolution to the correspondence theory of truth critique, in my view.
Yeah, I guess two things. One is like, it'd be probably good for you to go over what Chapman's solution is, because I don't know, and probably the audience doesn't know.
Yeah.
But two, before we get there, I think, again, there's a bit of an issue here because Chapman's not arguing directly against critical rationalism. So I think there's a bit of an issue where, like, obviously Jake and Chris's conversation were informed by Chris's views on Deutschianism. I don't think Chris was big into Popper, so I think he was getting a lot of his stuff from Deutsch, right? And so I think a lot of those conversations were framed about like Chris's interpretation of Deutschianism, and so they were sort of responding to that. So I think you made a pretty persuasive case that Popper had found and solved a lot of these problems. But I think you are somewhat unique in your willingness to say that conjecture and criticism is not the end of the road insofar as knowledge generation goes. I think there are a lot of, honestly, I don't want to say Deutsch because I'm not sure what his views are here, but I think there are certainly a lot of Deutschians who would just say it's conjecture and criticism, like sort of all the way down. And like, that's all we really need to know about how concepts are formed and how we do this, and like developmental psychology and all this stuff, it's sort of less relevant than just like epistemology is everything. And, it's just all conjecture and criticism. And so I think part of Chapman's view is like, no, there is a big story here for just like, biology and psychology to tell us like what the fuck is going on. And we actually have to deal with those messy disciplines and figure out how humans are forming things like representations of their world and things like this. And we can't just throw those sort of disciplines under the rug and say epistemology handles all of that. Right. And so insofar as you're saying that, and I'm saying that, I think he would agree. And I think that's actually part of his criticism. I think he's saying like, there is a big role for those sort of fields, and you can't just talk about, it's not enough to just talk about epistemology at full stop.
For sure. Yeah.
And I think we have also, I don't know if we actually talked about this on this podcast, but I think we've also made similar observations where like people would just sort of say the words conjecture and criticism and like, as if that's the end of the story. And it's like, there's still much more to explain after that. And so again, it's like we're in a bit of a weird position because he hasn't argued directly against Popper or Deutsch. And so we're kind of arguing against an interpretation of him arguing against an interpretation of like Popperianism and Deutschianism. So again, it's like, I just want to emphasize, it's kind of unclear exactly where the disagreements are.
Super fair point. On the saying conjectures and refutations is not sufficient, I completely agree. Popper would agree too. He basically just drew a very sharp line between where his theory ends and where psychology begins, in the sense that he didn't want to go into the psychology aspect of things. Partially, this is because so much of his output was trying to make objective the theory of knowledge, where previously knowledge had only ever been interpreted in the subjective belief sense. And so he's trying to wrestle epistemology out of psychology. And so he just didn't go into the psychology aspect. Because saying conjectures and refutations doesn't explain why we conjecture in the first place. That's why I love Brian Boyd's work, because I thought he made some progress there. And it doesn't explain a fuck ton of stuff. It's like, I think that the problem of saying conjectures and refutations explain everything is kind of just a human nature problem of becoming too infatuated with any one particular framework. Yeah. And you find one framework and use it everywhere and say this explains everything. And Popper Deutsch explains a shit ton, but it does not explain everything. And we definitely need developmental psychology. We need people like Paul Bloom, Liz Spelke. We need study of language. We need our Pinkers. All of this is filling in the picture. And yeah, I would object to anyone saying that. Yeah. Like if you walk into a developmental psychology seminar and say, well, I've figured out the answer to how children acquire language. It is through conjecture and refutation. And you just write QED and you leave the lecture hall. Like people are going to say, well, you haven't explained a goddamn thing, man. And so I think it's useful to recognize that conjecture and refutation is so valuable because it is a corrective to the dominant view of knowledge, but it is not the be all end all, can explain everything. And so totally agree that it's not the end of the story. Okay, so what does Chapman say? So I'll just read a quote. This is from Meta-Rationality.com, his post on vagueness. I don't know if the title is vagueness or just the URL says vagueness. That's all I've written down. So I'll just read a quote. So this is Chapman. So he introduces the word reasonableness. I don't know how he's using that word, but I think it's just what he means when he's like, how to be rational, but not succumb to all these rational fallacies. Yeah,
I think that's exactly right. Like how people in real life just go about navigating problems and stuff outside of like a formal rational framework.
So he says, reasonableness is not interested in universality. It aims to get practical work done in specific situations. Precise definitions and absolute truths are rarely necessary or helpful for that. Is this thing an eggplant? Depends on what you want to do with it. Is there water in the refrigerator? Well, what do you use it for? What counts as baldness, fruit, red, or water depends on your purpose and all sorts of details of the situation. These details are so numerous and various that they can't all be taken into account ahead of time to make a general formal theory. Any factor might matter in some situation. On the other hand, nearly all are irrelevant in any specific situation. So determining whether the water in an eggplant counts or if Alan is bald is usually easy. Okay, so the definitions we use, the categories we superimpose, are all situational, problem dependent, dependent on the task at hand, dependent on what you're trying to do. This is what Popper means by problem situation. This is what Popper, this is Popper. Yeah. So he's just a couple other quotes. So this is from Meta-Rationality.com/objective objects. Do cow hairs that come out of the follicle but are stuck to the cow by friction, sweat, or blood count as part of the cow? Or how about ones that are on the verge of falling out but are stuck in the follicle by only the weakest of bonds? The reasonable answer is, dude, it doesn't matter. And it's like, okay, well, first, there's a bit of like a Wittgensteinian thing where it's like he spends page after page after page convincing you of a problem only to resolve it by saying that the problem doesn't matter. And it's a stupid problem to begin with. And it's like reading Wittgenstein and getting to the end only to find out that his main point is if you really understood him, then everything you read is a complete waste of time. Like, okay, well, I get what you're saying. It's just, I think, slightly more helpful to talk in terms of implicit definitions, problem, situation, and context, which is just baked into Popper. So the answer he arrives at is the answer that Popper arrived at 70 years ago. Would you disagree with that?
No. I wish I had come across his solution, actually. And like, also just, the fact that you can find this paragraph where he lays out the solution. I'm, again, just a little bit confused, like why people don't bring up the solution sort of at the beginning, right? Like it doesn't seem like that difficult of a solution to just like give.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, I'm glad you found that. I'm pretty convinced.
Yeah. So the other angle into nebulosity that Popper addresses is in his discussions on precision. So I think talking about precision is interesting because it both addresses ontological precision. Is this a chair or is it a collection of wood and screws? But it also addresses linguistic precision. And he writes in his autobiography how many people are obsessed with achieving absolute perfect precision and how he just thinks this is a complete fool's errand. Yeah, so I'm going to read a quote from Unending Quest, Popper's autobiography, where he comments upon exactly what Chapman's saying he doesn't comment upon.
Well, not that Chapman ever says that, but to be fair.
Or whoever's saying that Chapman says he doesn't say talk about this is who I'm referring to. So he's talking about this guy, Frege, and Frege writes that a definition of a concept must determine unambiguously of any object whether or not it falls under the concept. Using a metaphor, we may say, the concept must have sharp boundaries. And then Popper says, so this is Frege's quote, and Popper says in response, but it's clear that for this kind of absolute precision to be demanded of a defined concept, it must first be demanded of the defining concepts and ultimately of our undefined or primitive terms. Yet this is impossible. For either our undefined or primitive terms must have a traditional meaning, which is never very precise, or they are introduced by so-called implicit definitions, that is, through the way they are used in the context of a theory. This last way of introducing them, if they have to be introduced, seems to be the best. But it makes the meaning of the concepts depend on that of the theory, and most theories can be interpreted in more than one way. As a result, implicitly defined concepts, and thus all concepts which are defined explicitly with their help, become not merely vague, but systematically ambiguous. And the various systematically ambiguous interpretations may be completely distinct. So this, he says, should be sufficient to establish the fact that unambiguous concepts or concepts with sharp boundaries do not exist. And then he concludes by saying, always remember that it is impossible to speak in such a way that you cannot be misunderstood, which I think is a great principle. There will always be some who misunderstand you. If greater precision is needed, it's needed because the problem to be solved demands it. Simply try your best to solve problems and do not try in advance to make your concepts or formulations more precise in the fond hope that they will provide you with an arsenal for future use in tackling problems which may not arise. They may never arise, and the evolution of the theory may bypass all your efforts. So again, this is just Popper commenting on the nebulosity critique and just saying it's impossible and just use words as tools, solve practical problems, get things done. And I've combed a decent amount of Chapman's work, and I can't find a solution that Chapman offers that isn't completely contained in what Popper says. So again, maybe this is a place where Jake or Chris need to knock some sense into me, and maybe this is a place where the Buddhism stuff starts to come into play. But from what I can tell, it's all baked into Popper already.
Yeah, nice. I mean, I think there's a second strand of the critique that I'm sort of less comfortable with that we probably don't have time to go into today, but it has to do with like again, it comes back to like the conjecture and refutation thing, but like sort of like a criticism that, like, you know, when you're showing Georgia the ball, it's sort of silly to describe that as conjecture and refutation. Like they would start to use the words like embodiment and like you're interacting with the environment. It's not all about just like your mind engaging in this like guessing and checking process all the time. Like sometimes it's best to describe a process as like, yeah, you are just being sort of given certain knowledge. Like I hand you a ball and I tell you this is a ball. Now you sort of have this concept of a ball. We're not sure how that arises in the mind, but calling it like guessing and checking or conjecture and criticism seems sort of silly. And sometimes I can get behind that. Like, again, conjecture and criticism was like a breakthrough by Popper insofar as it disavowed the notion of like absolute certainty and ultimate authority across all these applications, right? And then Popper spent his career fleshing this out in like morality, politics, etc. So that was like obviously a huge breakthrough. But there are activities in daily life where describing the knowledge generation process as conjecture and criticism does seem to be like a stretch. And so that's like a semi-convincing critique that I've thought less about. But I think that it's unclear to me how precisely that's related with the nebulosity stuff, or whether that's just something else entirely.
Yeah, well, I would say that it wouldn't be accurate to say it's not conjecture and refutation. I would say that that's not sufficient to explain all of what's going on, but there has to be some conjectural procedure in there somewhere. And I think that what's happening is for very obvious things like, Ben, can you pass me that glass of water? And then you need to conjecture what I mean when I say pass glass water. And then you operate on that. Like that's true. It's just the conjecture component happens so immediately because the implicit knowledge and definitions are just so readily apparent. If there was a language difficulty, if I spoke Spanish and you spoke French, then that same transaction would become much more difficult. And the work of conjecturing in that context becomes much more apparent because you don't have the same background knowledge. So you actually do have to use a lot of work to try to figure out, to guess what I mean. But because we have language, which almost by definition uses the fact that we have such a deep shared understanding of what these words mean, that's what I think masks the conjecture component of that example. But it's still there. It just happens instantaneously
under the surface,
under the surface, and that's why it's not terribly explanatory because it doesn't give you very much in that situation, but it's still there. So it's was it necessary but not sufficient, I guess, to explain what's going on. Yeah. So because I see Chapman's stuff as basically just rediscovering Popper, maybe the connections to Buddhism are interesting. Maybe there's some connections between. Like maybe he's forged connections between critical rationalism and Buddhism that haven't been apparent, and that's potentially quite interesting. I don't know, but yeah. So maybe there's some interesting connections between embodiment and Buddhism, and I don't want to dismiss that. But yeah. So that's what I have to say about Chapman and the relationship between meta-rationality and critical rationalism. Are there any other loose ends on your side that you think are worth addressing before?
I think we should just show this to Chris and Jake, and if they're mad at you, they can come on and yell at you, and I can watch from the sidelines and laugh, and it'll be great. Yeah,
just a little friendly fire between podcasts, but hopefully it's all taken in the spirit of loving criticism, and I look forward to the counter criticism. So
nice.
Cool. Well, to be continued, mon frere, and look forward to hearing Jake and Chris's reaction.
Boom.